unfortunately was going to come in and then had COVID.
Yeah. I'm Tara Volkov, so I'm with the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation, transitioning from the Cookeville Field Office to Nashville to be the new Regional Director of External Affairs.
All right, I think that's everybody we have online right now, and some more may trickle in. But circa a year ago, right after the Regional Transportation Plan was adopted, my predecessor, Ben Gramley, who was the original contact with some of you, may have brought up this regional conservation strategy. This is actually one of his slides. And so we had this idea, similar to some of our sister organizations, of developing a comprehensive environmental plan or strategy, really getting, yes. Oh, they didn't share again? Sorry, I know last time. I'm sorry, I'm having struggles apparently. All right. Take 47. So we had come up with this idea of doing this regional environmental plan and really doing a comprehensive, like all environmental resources and how to manage them, what are the trade-offs, but we honestly felt that was like kind of a lot to chew. So we decided to pivot and still do something like this, and that is our ultimate goal, but really focusing on topics individually first, understanding that there will be some repetition as we go in through kind of siloing each topic and then finding those kind of interconnections and trade-offs later after we've gone through a few of these exercises. And so we really want to focus on hot button issues, as you can say, but it's just to be a lot more focused, deliberate, and really engage people on topics that they may be kind of familiar with rather than overwhelming with everything at once. And so we hope to go through these 6 steps with each topic. I've tried to complete the first 3 to the best of my ability so that we can really utilize y'all's expertise to innovate and brainstorm, draft ways to enhance it and understand threats or risks. But I've gone ahead and gone through a lot of the data for existing and trends, as well as the existing policy, which was all kind of documented in that pre-meeting packet that you received, and also is in the back of your packet today if you need to reference it. But again, just how this fits with GNRC. For those that don't know, GNRC does a lot of regional planning. We're the MPO, so we do the Regional Transportation Plan. We're also the Development District, so we did the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, which this group has already helped with both of those. We hope to do a regional housing strategy in the near future. And then again, we're really just segmenting parts of a regional environmental strategy that we can later quilt together. And then ultimately, we might reach up to like a Middle Tennessee 2050 and like a big plan of how to really encompass all of those topics. I like to show this slide because we really want to take the right-hand approach with these topics and then come back to the left-hand approach. And so these are 2 models of sustainability. The right hand being like environment kind of prioritizes everything else, above everything else because other things depend on it. And the left being like they're more equal, and so we have to really account for all the trade-offs. Both are valuable, but I want you to take your tree hugger hat and put it on today for the right-hand approach and really think about how to maximize prioritizing the environment. And then we can go back to the left-hand approach when we start quilting these things together and talking more about economic and social issues. Why you all are here today, besides getting lunch and saying hey. We've already gotten a lot of data from this group in the last 2 years that we've convened. We hope to keep getting that data and updating it, as well as verifying it. Definitely supplement the research and policy work that I've been doing for the existing policy, but really your main roles are the bottom 2. We want to leverage your expertise, and you guys are more familiar with what's going on around the state or around the country that's really could be localized to our region. And of course, leveraging your networks with our network so that we can really expand our capacity and expand the knowledge sharing, because we don't want to duplicate any programs or policies or briefs that you guys are already putting out. We want a value add for the whole group to share it. So I've tried to my best of my abilities, like I said, do this kind of blue arrow. The orange arrow, identifying those best practices, kind of brainstorming is what we're kind of doing today. Then we'll kind of draft it up into whatever its final format may be, which is a resource hub, it might be a formal report, it could be a combination, and then really sharing that out and engaging with our local leadership, our local staff, other agencies to start talking about each topic individually. So if you noticed in your packet, today is really focused on open space and land conservation. That is kind of the goal, first topic for us. It's really foundational to a lot of work that everyone's doing. Land is just kind of the first resource on everyone's brain. And it's also really foundational to our planning work. We do local land use planning, we do comprehensive plans, so it's just so kind of interdisciplinary, even though it's just one topic. And it also is kind of the most apparent pressures that we're experiencing in our region because of all the dramatic growth that we have seen and we're going to see, how that's affecting development patterns, costs of living, how that's going to affect the spaces that we want to protect. And then kind of more localized to our region, there is a desire to maintain the rural history and character that Tennessee is used to. And so how do you balance that with also density and growth? So when we're thinking about open space and land conservation today, I borrowed this definition from the Forest Service because it's just the most encompassing. I think it's the best way people can really connect to land because some people see that as an agricultural view, some see that as their neighborhood park, or wildland, natural forest that's never been touched. So I think having a really broad definition will enable us to really think creatively. And then I threw this one up there. I think everyone here knows why we should protect open spaces, but the orange numbers are actually a study that was done on the Cumberland region by a nonprofit, Cumberland Region Tomorrow, which is a 10-county area. So it's not even the whole GNRC region, but it's billions and billions of dollars annually that they valued in these different ecosystem services, not even including the ecosystem services of it sustaining itself. So a lot of those supporting services are just so difficult to value, but all of the recreational and the export products, it's a really valuable part of our region. So I'm going to pivot and do a very brief data overview. For those that have been with this group, we have loads of data, and we have that on our website under the Roundtables page. I'm just going to go over a couple of trends today, but if you want a data deep dive, we'll have to just send that material out because it's too much to go through. But this is our region as it stands today. Today, 2019 is the latest, but it's the National Land Cover Database from USGS, and it's at that county resolution, so it's not super localized, but it does offer a great regional view. So you can see our agricultural areas and then all the urban centers, but for a large part of the region, it's still very green, which is good, but all the much more pertinent to really be planning for this. So like I said, 50% is looking green, and then another 30 is still considered undeveloped. It's agricultural, so 80% undeveloped is showing how much of a greenfield region we still really are, even though we've experienced a lot of growth. But the trend is showing over the last 18 years that we are losing a lot of those lands. They're potentially being converted to grass or shrubland, so pasture, which is less productive, or pre-development clearing, and then a lot of gain of urban and impervious surfaces. So this is our most current protected areas. I'm sure some of you have seen this map before or are really familiar with it, including protected waters. And this is most up to date thanks to our friends who have sent us their latest land trusts and conservation easements. But you can see our large swaths as well as our kind of smaller properties, totaling to over 420,000 acres. So some of the planning priorities, and so these maps aren't necessarily targeted data points, but they are just planning exercises that were done at a regional level by different organizations. This one is the State Wildlife Action Plan that was done a few years ago, and it's habitat conservation priorities with a species focus. And so this is priorities for different terrestrial, aquatic, and karst animal species. Similarly, the Nature Conservancy did a study as well. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. That was really valuing biodiversity and conservation value as it relates to climate change. So where things are going to be more resilient to climate and where there may be possible corridors for species to migrate. This is a composite of those two, so where they're overlapping. And then another study that was done is the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. This is southeast of the United States, so it's kind of a mega region. But this is not just at habitat. It is trying to focus on conservation value more generally, and they prioritized high and medium based on different goals. And also, semi-recently, we had Division of Forestry present their Forest Action Plan, which is obviously targeted at forest cover priorities. Most of this map is blue because they categorized it by the service the forest is providing, and most of the ones in our region are providing a water, either purification or runoff service. And here's a messy map of all of those priorities overlaid and what's already protected in pink. So those priorities are really aligned. It's no wonder that those different planning exercises identified the same types of habitats and lands, and that the largest conservation areas that are already protected directly overlap with those. But we can start to see spatially just where we need to prioritize and focus some of the policy ideas that we're going to come up with today. And this is just a better kind of gradient representation of that rather than a messy transparency. And so this is really showing how all of those stack up with a direct overlap. And this is that same map, but just in a little bit clearer way to understand it, and with the exact percentages. So where all three of those overlap, it makes up almost half of the Forest Action Plan, a third of the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, and 25% of the other ones. So it really is beneficial to think about all of them together, but still recognizing they all identified separate priorities, and then how much of that is already protected, and then how much still needs to be protected or at least considered and managed better. So that was overwhelming, I'm sure. And that was just a very brief data set overview. But just the main takeaways is that we're still very much a greenfield region. We have a lot of acreage protected, which is in our high priority areas, which is great. There is certain areas that are going to be threatened by future development based on our current forecasts that are unprotected. And so we need to figure out whether we need to, conserve that in perpetuity or how to manage it and everything. And of course that we're not only going to have a lot of development, but more people, how that's going to affect development, and especially in those 4 counties are more urban counties. So now that I've overwhelmed you with some data, I'm going to overwhelm you with some policy. And it's going to be kind of quick in the beginning because I did send out those federal and state overviews beforehand. So I'm really just going to breeze through those. And then most of you are probably familiar with them anyway, but if you do have a question, please stop me. So generally, federal policies usually just establish agencies, funding sources, procedural guidelines. The main ones pertinent to open space land conservation, Land and Water Conservation Fund, great funding source, NEPA, which we are all very familiar with, I'm sure, and it really helps those procedural guidelines for federal review of impacts to the environment. Similarly, the Farmland Protection Policy Act does the same thing, except really targeted at agricultural lands. And the Farm Bill, of course, provides a lot of funding and subsidies to farmers. The state policies, I did include some other definitions because state policies are really important for how they do define and classify things. And then they're usually utilizing those for the purposes of protecting from local regulation because we are a state enabling state. So anything that locals want to exercise in a regulatory power has to be enabled by the state beforehand, and conversely can be limited by the state. So Greenbelt Law is a great statewide tax incentive that you might be familiar with for properties classified as ag, forest, or open space, where they actually get to be taxed based on its present use, even if development pressures around it would heighten its market value. And so it has a disincentive. If you want to remove that green belt classification, you have to pay back 3 years of tax savings. So that's a really strong law program. But right to farm is, again, a limitation on local zoning powers against agricultural zoning. Not zoning per se, but they are limited in how they can regulate structures and uses on agricultural lands, which is really interesting. And then this is where I'm going to slow down, try to, and really overwhelm you with local policy research. And so the packet that you have, the packet you received before, kind of defined what these tools are. I'm going to briefly go over what those definitions are as we go through it, but essentially local policies dictate development constraints and building in your community. So where it can go, what it can be used for, how big the building is, building code, all of that, within, again, the parameters of state legislation. So in the GNRC region, 14 counties, there are 68 jurisdictions, including the counties and the cities. So I went through all of their zoning and subdivision regulations, which is all of their kind of development constraints bundled into 2 documents. The 8 I did not review, either have no regulations at all. Humphreys County does have subdivision regulations, but they didn't really have any actual requirements for the tools we're looking at today. And then, unfortunately, City of Cross Plains only has a copy of their zoning at the City Hall, and I didn't get a trip up there, so I hope to go up there and make a copy one day. But at this time, they were not included. So the first tool, minimum lot size zoning, again, minimum, so it's just the standard for where you would want to put a house in this zone. It has to be at least this many acres or whatever, and so this can really preserve agriculture, rural character, a really large yard, whatever your kind of goal is, but it dictates the size of your property. So I did look at 3 types of these minimum lot sizes: agricultural, again, for ag practices; estate lot, which is typically just to maintain the kind of historic home character that may be in an area like Belmead; and then rural lot zoning is typically smaller, but it does allow for more just low density single family in more rural areas. So like some parts of Smyrna are more rural than others. You'd want to maintain a larger lot size. So of the 60 reviewed, agriculture was commonly 4 to 5 acres minimum. So you could have a much larger farm, but that was the minimum you had to have. Estate, commonly 1 to 3 acres, and then rural is smaller, but it's still a sizable acreage. You know, you wouldn't see 1/3 of an acre in downtown Nashville, so it's still a great tool for maintaining character. And I want you to think, as I go through all of these policies, how this is like different in different communities, right? Like what works for Nashville is not going to work in Gallatin or Stewart County. And so we need to also contextualize, like, is 4 to 5 acres too high or too low of a threshold in certain places? What kind of place? Just have that in the back of your mind, please. Another tool, conservation subdivisions or cluster developments. They're a little different, but they kind of do the same thing, where you're allowed to kind of cluster the lots and adjust the lot sizing in order to go around sensitive environmental lands or increase density, but in exchange for that, you typically have to reserve open space elsewhere. So cluster developments typically have a lower requirement for the open space. It may be more built upon, like a playground. It has to be just more recreational. Typically 15 to 20% of the total subdivision. And then some others, just the aggregate area by which you reduced the lot sizes. So if you submit your site plan and every lot had to be an acre, but you put them down to a ½ acre, then the Planning Commission will just require you take each ½ acre for those lots and put it in one spot. And then similarly, conservation design standards or conservation subdivisions, it's a little more of a newer practice, so only 11 of our communities have that option. And again, these are voluntary options for a developer. Typically, it's not mandated. But those commonly require 50% or more of the entire tract to be conserved and usually preserved, usually untouched and not really built upon recreational lands, but just like wild forest in your neighborhood. And some go as far to designate areas you have to conserve no matter what. So if 75% of the tract was primary conservation lands, you'd have to maintain all of it. You couldn't just meet the 50%. So different communities vary on how strong their policies are, obviously. Including steep slope protection for kind of capturing the scenic viewshed portion of land conservation, as well as just better building practices and hillsides. So of the 60 reviewed, about 38, so a little more than half, have a steep slope protection or regulation standard, commonly regulating 15 to 20% grade, sometimes lower, sometimes higher, but that was the most common. The standards and definitions vary greatly on this one. So sometimes it's the slope, sometimes it's the soil, sometimes it's only riparian or waterway slopes, so really just erosion and not as much hillside, and as well as karst. And then the protections also vary greatly since the definitions could vary greatly. So some complete protection, no disturbance at all, no building. And then others had some partial protections, like, again, increasing the minimum lot size so you can move the house around on the lot and potentially disturb less area. Some just designated as a critical lot, which when you submit a site plan, that just really calls it out to the Planning Review Commission so that it's like, hey, this is a critical lot, maybe ask them to move it, but it's not legally binding. It's really just up to the discretion of the Planning Commission most of the time. Usually they'll still tell you to move it, but, and then others, they've allowed you to just disturb half of the sloped area. So less of a really legally binding regulatory tool is a community open space plan. So I included this because we still want to think about conservation in our urban areas, don't want a city with no parks. So we included parks and recreation master plans, as well as greenways and trails master plans, which are great for those, cross connections across jurisdictions, or if they had a really significant goal in their comprehensive land use plan and didn't maybe have a separate planning document for it. So 27 of the 60 have a plan in place. A lot of the recommendations from those types of plans are to review and improve their regulatory development constraints for environmental considerations. Some want to really spearhead open space acquisition and conservation easement in the city, or as well as explore transfer development rights and how they can locally set up a city or county land bank. Urban forestry is another common consideration in these types of plans, and really having that as a staff position or program formally in the city or county. And then all of them really include parkland dedication or other incentives that they can do to fund all of these types of things. So I included urban forestry and tree ordinances because tree ordinances are fascinating if you've never read one. And of course, the trees are such an important piece of the land that we want to conserve. So of the 60 reviewed, 33 had some tree protection or replacement standard at all. And then those structures are very different. So I like to say you can require, you can incentivize, or you can encourage. And so requiring is obviously a minimum. You have to mandate, so requiring existing tree retention. Incentivizing, so just making it more attractive, and then encourage is more of a, here's a voluntary option if you want. But in this case, 7, so I think it's being a little underutilized, are requiring existing tree retention, a minimum percentage of tree canopy you have to keep there, and then also additional planting you have to do. Many, much more common, incentivize tree retention, so it counts towards your planting requirements. If you have to put in a parking lot with trees, if you save half the trees, it's like a 2-for-1 or whatever the incentive is. Of course, they also require tree replacement, and those thresholds can vary. Typically, inch per inch replacement, remove 12 inches, replace 12 inches. Sometimes it's just half of the replacement ratio. And then others, it's still an option to pay into a city fund where you can just pay dollars per inches and then they plant a tree somewhere else. And there's some controversy with that because you're kind of moving canopy around your city. And then 3, I really want to applaud Ashland City, Brentwood, and Franklin, definitely being an underutilized tool, but actually disincentivize removal and replacement. So not only incentivizing existing retention, but disincentivizing and making it harder for you to remove a tree by requiring a greater ratio of replacement than removal. So if you take out 12 inches, you have to plant 24. And that's like a lot of pressure on a developer, because now you have to pay to remove the tree, pay for all the new trees, plant them, etc. Last tool, I promise, and then we can breathe, and I hope you're done eating. But this one, you might be surprised why there's a historic building for transfer of development rights. So another kind of underutilized tool, the state does enable locals to do this. Only 4 offer kind of a TDR, as you would say, option: Kingston Springs, Nashville, Columbia, and Fairview. Asterisk to Columbia, they have a draft code that is yet to be adopted, so it's not in their current code, but it's in the draft. And in the case of those 3, it's very historic focused. So when you have a National Register place and you limit the development of that building in perpetuity, its modern day zoning development rights could be allocated somewhere else. So in Nashville, it's in high growth areas like the Gulch or downtown. And then Kingston Springs actually had a really innovative one to me. I was surprised by it. But it can be used within PUD or those kind of cluster development districts, but across those districts. So when you make a PUD district, it's usually a subdivision. And so let's say you make 20 lots, but you didn't sell 8 of them, or you ended up just running out of money, whatever happened. You could actually transfer those building rights for those 8 lots that were in your site plan to another subdivision that's willing to buy it. And so I think a main barrier with TDR for a lot of locals is how to set up those sending and receiving. That's honestly the biggest barrier. They don't know where to put that information, how to connect people. So that might be why a lot of them don't have it written into their code, or because it is harder to kind of figure out your land use and densities that you want in your community if you're flexing them. But that one was really interesting. So I hope you're dazzled. I hope you're overwhelmed. I do want to open it up for just a group discussion. We'll just raise hands. We don't have to go around the room. But if you have just reactions or fears, no, I'm kidding. I put some prompts and some examples up there, but I do really just want to hear from y'all, like what you were surprised by, what you're kind of concerned about, what you believe some barriers may be, and then also, how do you think we're adequately doing it? What were you really excited to see that you thought was a really great practice to be spread? So I'm going to turn it to y'all now that I've talked a lot. Mr. Wadden, TWRA.
I'll kick in. So I appreciate all that information. I don't know if you've got that in the spreadsheet, especially for like the policies. So I have to be kind of interesting to look at and see what. Last decade, 3 fastest growing counties in the state were Williams, Rutherford, and Wilson County. Almost top, they were 30+% in all 3 of them. So I'm thinking that when we start to look at open space policies, we're going to have to look at it from a community by community perspective. Because Nashville is a different animal than Murray County or whatever, just because of the way it's laid out. And then locally, I wish Nashville had something like retaining trees, because when they do a new development, they go in there and they clear the entire tract, build all the houses, and they might plant a few trees. We've got, at least within a mile of my house, I live in a fairly rural part of Nashville, Hermitage. There are 3 different developments, probably over 200 acres, all of them been cleared. And putting in, we're zoned, even though we're somewhat rural, we're zoned for 2.5 houses per acre. So I think you're going to have to look at it community by community and try to really, where we're going to put the open space and where we need to have.
I'm just going to briefly summarize what you said for those online, because it's hard to hear. I know, I'm sorry. He was saying how it's definitely community by community, and that the needs and conservation practices will differ greatly based on how much growth they've seen, and also, for example, Nashville really should preserve its tree canopy since so much of it is already built up. That was kind of what Greg said. Anyone else? Reactions? Yeah.
So I've been in green for about 10 years, and since COVID and how many people are moving to Nashville, it seems like it's even more difficult now to, kind of like your economic value statements, like getting appraisals that support what an individual thinks their land is worth, or trying to make acquisitions, and even purchase conservation easements, you need to make it happen from the people, if you're trying to conserve land, especially in a highly developing area where there are developers that are ready to give money over, it's really hard as a land trust or an environmental organization to come in and balance that and either be able to pay the same or work as quickly. So that's been a huge challenge, especially since COVID, at least at Tech Marine.
For those online, Christy Henderson from 10 Green, which is a land trust conservation easement agency, was saying that the big challenge with conservation easements is that it's really, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. There's a barrier with how quickly developers can move and the costs associated with high pressure areas and conserving those.
I also think that younger generations, especially if it comes to agricultural land, they don't want to farm. The incentive there is a lot less than their parents or grandparents, but they leave, there's no one there that is able-bodied to farm the land that gets sold off. So thinking about that perspective as well. How do we incentivize young people to want to stay farm or conserve their land in a different way?
That's a great point. I know I brought up zoning and everything. This isn't to say things can't be rezoned. So it could always be rezoned and then subdivided into a smaller area as well. But she was talking about how younger people may not want to continue farming, and so how do you incentivize a farm that was historically a farm to maintain open space or as a farm? Is there anyone online with input?
Do you see anything coming out of all the flooding? I mean, I'm thinking, you mentioned Humphreys County not having any sort of planning at all. And I just wonder, are there any conversations coming out about how to rebuild those communities or have better, building standards, move stuff out of floodplain? I don't know. I mean, the floodplain is changing as well, of course. So.
Yeah, with flooding, that doesn't necessarily have to be in a zoning ordinance or subdivision regulation, so it can be a separate floodplain ordinance. So they do have a floodplain ordinance now because of the Waverly issue, flooding that happened there. And so they've enrolled in the NFIP and they have a floodplain ordinance. And they actually do have subdivision regulations. It just didn't include any of the tools that I talked about today. But in places like Houston County and Stewart County, I don't think they even have building codes. Like, they don't have subdivision regulations or zoning. And so it's kind of the Wild West. No, I'm kidding. But, I mean, they also have the least development pressure, but in all of those planning exercises, those were the bluest and greenest counties along the river. So it's kind of a weird pickle that those communities may be in as growth sprawls. I mean, if it sprawls all the way out there, it'll put some pressure for sure. Dory online has her hand raised.
You hear me?
Can we yes.
A mute now. Does that work?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, I was doing the mute button wrong. We've been thinking about this for a long time because of all these different tools, and I know that. So one thought, we're all looking at all the data in terms of open space conservation for whatever purposes, endangered species or forestry, whatever it might be, which is really cool. And so one of the things that we're interested in is, can we look at it also in terms of what can we do in terms of climate change, like carbon dioxide sinks? Is there a way to incentivize? And I assume there's people out there, the Nature Conservancy and others, who have some sense of how much actual types of forests sequester. And so that would be like another reason to do some of this type of these tools, would be for because of all the growth in this area. It seemed, and we still have a lot of green, but it's like, how much is it actually helping with carbon sinks? It just might be a different priority or perspective. And then the second thing I was going to bring up to follow up on one of the comments earlier about we have a lot of people coming out of the ag schools. They may not want the large properties of farming because that used to be for large cattle production or tobacco, but they are interested in 20 or 50 acres max, even 10 for cheese and so much more of the farm to table movement. Or they don't need as much land, but the land becomes so expensive. Example, Williamson County, that you're 500, you may not want 500 acres, but you can't even afford 10. And that would still be more for an ag type industry. So it's kind of like, what kind of ag do we want to have, and how can we, through all these different practices, actually incentivize it?
Yeah, I like that point, especially because, we're talking about wild forests and urban forestry at the same time. We definitely need to be thinking about urban ag versus rural ag as well. So thanks for bringing that up. I'll go to you and then to you.
Sure. I was thinking a little bit about your slide 15 that has some of the data around the benefits of protecting open space, and realizing there's a disconnect. A lot of those benefits are societal. They're not really realized at the individual scale. So a person who decides to conserve land isn't necessarily seeing the economic benefits of cleaner air, cleaner water. So just kind of recognizing there's that disconnect there, and I think that points to the importance of allowing things like working land or public access to land to really kind of give back some of those benefits.
That's a great point. She brought up how the ecosystem services slide that I showed isn't necessarily at the individual scale. So those incentives are more communal and greater good than they are to the individual landowner that may be interested in conservation. And then Dr. Archer?
I just wanted to know who who asked the last question. I want to follow up.
Online?
Yes, just the question about, most recent question.
That was Dory from the Harpeth Conservancy. She's the CEO. All right. Anything that you felt was adequately requiring or incentivizing, at least the policies that I went over? I feel like that was probably the most new information to this group. I feel like you guys are more familiar with the federal state trends, right? Don't make me call out. Was there anything urban forestry-wise that you were so proud of or excited by?
Well, it was interesting to see all the groups you pointed out with the different ordinances, because that's one thing that we report on some feds on who's got ordinances and kind of metrics. We don't get funding for it, so we have a hard time capturing that data. So just with the data that you've captured, how we can not duplicate, asking the same questions and maybe follow up on, what do they need? What are the next steps they need help on? Ordinances, removal, staff, a key thing. That's one of another metric that the feds are looking at. So where can we help out develop those programs as well?
Great. That was Robert from the Tennessee Urban Forestry Council was saying that it was interesting to see the different ordinances because the feds are interested in seeing that information. And it may help provide information on how to help locals with tree ordinances and tree boards and other things. I feel so awkward summarizing it right after you say it. I'm so sorry.
Who is enforcing, talking about the tree ordinance, whose job is it to enforce after those trees get supposedly replaced, or, who's checking on that? Who's saying, sure? You can plant trees right for repairs, but say, don't get me started about right repairs, but they also, could die in a year, and then what's enough? Does anyone follow up on that?
Yes. So a lot of times in the tree ordinance, it also says, it has to be maintained minimum a year and that they'll come out and check on it. And if you don't meet that, then there's some kind of penalty with tree ordinances. It's typically probably a codes enforcement staffing, and they may delegate that to Parks and Rec. It might differ for each community, tree boards, but ultimately it will go through the general development review process, and then any enforcement issues with any development code is typically up to codes enforcement. So they're going to go out and check the building materials, the lot lines and setbacks, as well as tree removals. And tree removal also typically requires a permit, so you're already going through that hoop. So there's different administrative ways to keep track. All right, Dory, you got your hand raised again?
Yeah, we've worked with a number of the tree ordinances over the years, a bit, and they've all gotten relatively decent. You know, like they'll prohibit invasive species being planted and things like that. But I wonder if there's been a real look at how many trees do you want planted to create the kind of canopy you want to cool the city, things like that, depending on where you are. And there's privacy. There's a lot of reasons why there are tree ordinances, but they may not all be working in tandem to get a certain regional goal we want. So I just want to throw that out there that depending on the people on those tree committees, you'll get some really great tree ordinances because they know all about invasive species and things like that. And some people are just like, I just want privacy. You know, I don't care what it is, as long as it's a green vegetated privacy line.
Yeah, I'll say even more generally, comparing across the communities, it was maybe clear what someone in staff, someone within the mayor, the leadership, the planning commission, what their priorities may have been, because one community might have a really strong tree ordinance, but then no steep slope protections, or a really strong like riparian buffer, which we'll talk about at a later date. But you know, it was clear where they were maybe targeting their focus on certain issues, or where they had expertise in that, and where they might not have in other tools and these measures. So looking at them comprehensively was really fascinating, to be honest. And to Greg's earlier comment, I will be sharing out the policy research in a document. So.
That must have been a painful exercise.
It really was. Especially the really small communities that don't have a website or have it online. So in the case of Cross Plains, they couldn't scan a copy in time. And you'll notice your packet's actually outdated because Orlinda sent theirs over yesterday. And so your packet says 59, but I got theirs and put it in, so. Yep.
Mark, do you have, since you did all this reviewing policies, local policies, do any of them stand out in your mind as being good model policies?
I think the two that really stood out would be the ones that were the least common, would be the disincentivizing tree removal and replacement, especially because, I mean, Brentwood and Franklin are both in Williamson County, but Ashland City was doing it too. So it's not a model that's like not applicable everywhere. I think that's a really great idea. Instead of just incentivizing, disincentivize, make it harder, more expensive. The other one would be the transfer of development rights. I've seen that it's a common issue anywhere because it can be difficult to set up those sending and receiving. But like one example, the Cumberland River Compact's not here. I know they set up kind of a mitigation bank with TDOT to figure out sites for mitigation. So if we could set up that kind of a bank, even just regionally or wherever, that would be one barrier reduction of like, I'm willing to sell my rights to develop and I'm willing to buy them. But it is difficult, but I wish more communities were taking advantage of it. And it's interesting, the historic focus in our region. I know we have some SHPO people online, if they have any comments on historic transfer of development rights. What?
Nope.
Okay. Dory, I think you have your hand raised again.
Yeah, but if you want to wait and see if anybody wants to talk about the historic stuff, I'll get back to TDRs after that. That's no problem.
Okay.
Hey, this is Holly from the SHPO. I mean, we encourage whenever there is a big farm for people to take advantage of you know, through the land trust, historic covenants and things. But we haven't, to my knowledge, had any rural or, you know, open land kind of TDR situation that we could advertise right now at the moment. But
It is
And
important to know.
that's what I was gonna jump in on, is that we worked a lot on this. There's a bunch of we's out here in Williamson and County and Franklin about TDRs about 10 years ago, 15. And we supposedly there's some in working. You actually work with the Department of Ag, like it might be your county ag department, because you need a map that determines where the sendings, where the receipt, how do we say it? Where do you want to protect? You want this large rural area. So those are the folks who are going to be voluntarily able to sell the development rights. And then where's it going? Is it in Franklin? And in this case, we were discussing Williamson County, and we were thinking across the county. So that's kind of what's probably limiting a lot of the use of the TDRs in a broader context. Is it probably need some of our other government partners as a trusted entity for all that kind of stuff, and determining, what our sending zones are and what our receiving zones are and what are they for. Does that make sense? Like, you're not gonna be able to do it probably within the city confines. It's too small.
Yeah, I was going to point out something I forgot to mention. So the state enables TDR at the local level, but one of the limitations is that they have to be of the same general size and of the same general zoning district. So you can't take like farmland and put it like in your downtown and just build a high rise. Like, it doesn't work quite like that. It's more similar lands that, you're exchanging development rights. But I do want to pivot to more of our small group discussion. So now that you've had some time to ruminate and hear from everyone, want to split up into some smaller groups. And you have pens and paper, so you can write and whatever. But really thinking about those different policy types, so require, incentivize, or encourage, where it's a voluntary option versus a mandate. I put some example policies that just whatever on there, but can think really broadly of like, we really just need to, make sure everybody's aligned, at least within their own code, because that can be an issue, or a really specific policy that you think would be great. Overlay districts are a common zoning one where you want to just put in some policy measures. But for those online, you're going to be kind of lumped into one group. So I know there's 15 or 16 of you. It's kind of a larger group. But please use the raise hand function, and Mary will be facilitating for you. And then for those of us in the room, if we want to do like U3, U4, and then U4. Oh, sorry. You can join this group, 5. Sorry, you were not the U. So we'll kind of pause and work in like those smaller groups and take some notes, and then report back out via group. Any recommendations or ideas? Thanks.
Hey all, are you able to hear me? Oh, sorry, I need to get muted on the big one. Okay, is that better? Hang on. I'm just gonna switch rooms. Okay, is this in? Not sure. Is there any feedback? Yep. If you all want to start any of the discussion questions, feel free. I'm going to try to figure out how to shut the mic off in the room. Is this any better? Yes. Okay. Okay, there we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to leave the small group discussion slides up on here for a second so you all can look at those. But then I might try to take it down so you can see who's speaking. I know that'll kind of make it more of a format if we get it in a tile view. But essentially, what we're going to do in the small group discussion is to brainstorm and discuss solutions to those main themes that Carson talked about. And it looks like we have one comment in the chat already from someone who is curious about peer regions and what they are doing and to what extent we've looked at that. So, and also I will note, now we're in just in the small group. If you all have any questions or want to contribute to the discussion, feel free to unmute and go ahead and bring those to the group for this small group discussion.
I thought, this is Dory from the Harpeth Conservancy. Since I've been doing a lot of planning and zoning and work in all types of ways for 20 years. This is not my background. You kind of been learning it by being involved. It would be helpful to actually get a sense if there was something we really liked in another region, that they had 6 counties and they really wanted to accomplish X, like make sure there was enough tree cover or conserve endangered species. How do they link their policies together? Carson, now that she's looked at all of them, it'd be interesting to get a sense of, I know that the conservation subdivision, for example, if some of these things you really want aren't required, a lot of times they don't get used. If you like them, great. Or the hillside ordinance. We've had to change a lot of them because it was too complicated. We finally all drove around one day and said, just don't put buildings above that elevation. That was so much simpler than percent slopes. So, and then how do we share those types of tools to each other community, and what are we trying to accomplish? And in that case, it was aesthetics. You know, people like their hillsides and their little mountaintops not to be built on in this area. So it's, I feel like right now, most of the information's in Carson's head, and how do we all sort of get out there with everybody and go, hey, what are we trying to accomplish, and which tools are working well? Someone else maybe had mentioned it too, that in more less dense areas, the tools get adapted. If you're in a hyper rural urban area like Nashville, you'll do it differently because they don't transfer exactly from place to place. But offering as a volunteer program typically doesn't ultimately work. Do you see what I'm saying? Like you want them to do something, you kind of have to require it in the zoning and planning world.
I agree. I do think, zoning is a way to kind of force that. And so I'm Janie Camp. I'm a professor at Vanderbilt in civil environmental engineering. And this is also outside my scope. I do more work kind of on the flood management mitigation side for some of my research. And I also feel like there's this disconnect. I mean, I'm up in Inglewood, East Nashville, and you see these homeowners. I've got a friend that he wants to be sustainable, but he had a lot of trees fall in some of the recent storms. And so he's just taking them out. And my question to him is, well, what are you going to do to replace that? And so I see that there's, zoning is a way to kind of bring that down to the local homeowner situation as development occurs on the residential side. We have, at least in Nashville, low impact development regulations and things like that, but those don't necessarily really translate down to the local homeowner situation. And talking to folks in Metro Water, they're like, just plant trees, just plant trees. Well, that becomes a challenge when people are like, well, what trees and where do I plant them and how do I really do this? And if you're not knowledgeable, there's lots of resources through Metro Water and the Cumberland River Compact and Harpeth River Conservancy and others about things that can be planted. The Tennessee Tree Day, I just found information about that recently. I know there's also I think an American Legion group or something has a tree sale coming up, or Boy Scouts or something.
There's the Tree Conservation Corps too, which is really good. And they're based here in East Nashville.
Yeah. Thanks, Shelley.
Yep.
And so I feel like one thing, and I'm a proponent of like public education outreach, and I feel like people kind of understand the importance of trees, but maybe not fully. To bring it down to the local homeowner level. And when you do zoning and regulations, there has to be some sort of in between that helps like bridge that gap of here's the zoning and the regulations. How does the homeowner make the decisions or the developer on what to plant? And I'm on the Stormwater Management Committee for Nashville. And we have developers that are asking for variances to the ordinances, and there's rules and best practices that are followed on that. If you're going to disturb a wetland, we want to see, mitigation or, comparable things put back better. But for an individual homeowner, I feel like with all the development that's happening on single family lots throughout the region, as we see sprawl, I'd love to see us kind of make that connection and bring it down to the local homeowner with, how do we help enforce some of this preservation of tree canopy, or, as trees become in, poor condition when people need to take them down, how do we help them think about what goes back? And to kind of balance things out. As a homeowner myself, I'm debating, what do I keep? What do I take out? What do I, put in to mitigate some of the stormwater issues and other things here? So I guess that would be, sorry, not to get long-winded, but I think there's development regulations, and those are useful and beneficial, but we have a lot of residential property that we're losing canopy on, that we may want to think about that. And it's not just in Nashville, it's in the surrounding areas. We see more development and sprawl. So it's kind of like the death by 1,000 pinpricks. So that's my piece. I'll shut up now. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jeannie. I think a lot of what I heard as far as solutions and what you said is related to doing better education and public outreach to help homeowners understand what programs are out there to help them replace, and where they can even get trees to replace too. Definitely.
This is a really good point. I'm also thinking about with farmers, because there are, like, we've been doing a fair amount of 319 grants where the money is their voluntary access to monies on farms, riparian buffers, a million things. I'm thinking there might be of some value then at the individual level. Like, a lot of people, like, they got really poor, they don't even have good forestry, urban forestry training, and like, we need more people. Like, who do they call? How can they get some advice for some simple clearing? But then also, could they tap into some money for replacement when they've had storm damage, something like that? So, because it isn't cheap, to be honest. And so what tends to happen is when something's damaged, they're cut down, the trees are cut down, and then it's just grass. So a lot of people don't really know. They buy a piece of property, or they live in a neighborhood that's full of trees because they love it. They really don't know how to manage it, maintain it, or, as Jeannie's saying, replace it. And would possibly there be advantage of maybe having some funds for property owners?
I like the idea of funds and also guidance. I know we have, urban forestry and arborists and stuff.
Exactly.
And I've been to the Ellington Ag Center for the urban, like, gardening festival or something similar, and there were arborists there having conversations and stuff. And I agree that that maintenance and just care. Like, I have friends that don't know how to grow, like, just flowers for a garden. So when we're thinking about how do you decide what tree goes in beyond, hey, I think this looks pretty in the pot at the Lowe's or Home Depot, not thinking about how big it's really going to get and what care is needed, there's a gap to be filled.
Yeah, thank you, Jeannie. I think we've talked a lot about tree protection standards, which is great. I know we have a number of other folks on this call, so and I know you're not all GNRC staff, so if anyone wants to unmute and chip into the discussion, if they have thoughts also on tree preservation or some of the other things that were talked about, transfer development rights or community open space plans or conservation developments, any of those standards as well. I think we have seen the slide for long enough, so I'm going to go ahead and see if I can switch to a view where we can see all who's on the call.
Yeah.
See if that helps. 1 second. Sorry, you all can keep the discussion going. I have to go get someone else's computer to request control.
Would it be helpful if we all introduced ourselves? Because I don't, unless you have your picture up, all we see is TW or SH. I mean, I know one of them, but just maybe it'd be helpful just to pop off and just say who all's on the call on this group, and then we can see what our brain trust is that we can chat about.
This is Shelley Hazel. I'm with GNRC and also work with Cumberland Region tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Emily Grandstaff. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I came in like super late. I'm so sorry. So I missed the beginning part of this. So I'll try to contribute and figure out what we're talking about as we go.
I guess my question I have is, to what extent do we have, resources available? But I saw Maverick jumped on, so.
I was just going to introduce myself briefly. I'm Maverick Fitzgerald with the Memphis MPO, the counterpart to GNRC in our region. Mm-hmm. We are a solely transportation-focused MPO, though. So
Gotcha.
really, I'm just kind of here picking up a lot of what the GNRC is doing with data collection and NEPA connections.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Emily, I was going to share too, if you go back in the chat, Carson shared a copy of the packet with the slides from the presentation. If you want to flip through any of those for some of the policies that folks are talking about that were reviewed.
Okay, I may have it in, was it sent in an email? Because I think I can only start based on like when I joined the meeting. So it may have been previously.
Yeah, it was sent in an email. I'll send it again as well too.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
One of the most interesting things that this effort and a group of us can be doing here is looking at how we can take some of our local zoning and ordinances, all the kind of things local community, local local metro governments, whatever counties can do, that then operationalize some of these bigger things. Like the Endangered Species Act doesn't actually work at the local level unless you have like habitat conservation, but there's so many cool things out there. And that's one of the things we've had really a lot of fun with for the last 20 years is we can understand some of those bigger national programs or even state programs, but then integrating them and interpreting them into what would work at a local zoning, subdivision regs, how do we incentivize more ag, all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a huge opportunity. I don't think we all necessarily know the answers, but it's like, well, what the heck is working over there in Mount Juliet? And it's interesting to have people drive around and go, I like what it looks like. At the end of the day, I find most of it is about what people like, what they like what it looks like. And then I think it's up to all of us who might be more scientists or historic preservation types or whatever to go, that's great. They like that look. But we also know it's accomplishing, carbon sequestration or protecting endangered species, or frankly, it isn't. And so that's the trying to connect it with the individual or the planner or the elected official. A lot of it's kind of like, what do they like? What don't they like? And, what does it really mean from these other priorities perspectives?
Great, thank you, Dory. It looks like online we also have Tara, Linda with NRCS. Sorry, I'm going through to see who we haven't gotten introductions from. If you all want to pipe up and add to the discussion or just introduce yourself.
Definitely. Thank you, Mary. I'm Linda Ortiz. I work for NRCS. So I'm with the federal agency. So we have county offices in every county. We work mostly with Farm Bill programs on the conservation side of things. And I definitely will agree with Dory and Jenny about the community engagement, because, you know, I like what my neighbor is doing, so I want to do it too. So if you get the buy-in of the community, definitely I think any type of efforts out there will be more successful. So definitely community engagement, outreach, and definitely see what's working in other regions, in the other counties that can be transferable to the other counties, even around or even outside of the region. It would be nice to see the comparison between what is working here and what can be incorporated there. So I guess that's my 2 cents there, but definitely since we work mostly with farmers and they talk, so it's always good to know what one farmer like and how they transfer that excitement and, you know, passion about things that are working for them. So I just want to throw that out there.
That's a lot of what we see when we're working with the farm community. It's why you go to those monthly meetings and all, soil conservation district meetings and all that, because there's a lot of information that's transferred more verbally, and then it's by pamphlets, you know, and sort of like getting a sense of what the community feels like. And if I do this, will I be odd looking? All that kind of stuff. And other people want to be unique, but it's a lot of like, how much did it cost? How did you do that? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Linda, for those thoughts too.
And also to add, I mean, there's a lot of information out there. It's just putting it together so people have an easy access to it, because, well, there's a lot of us today here, right? And we know about what our agencies or organizations are offering, but there's so much out there. So, and it can be overwhelmed. So I think that's also part of the problem. Is like, okay, I know that I need to look for information, but there's so much out there. Which one should I start with? Or which one should I go for? I guess that's also another challenge out there.
Do you think there'd be a demand for a resource of like model policies? Like these are the types of things you could do, make it such that it's Tennessee focused or restricted, you know, we could have great peer reviews and all and policies from California that just wouldn't be applicable here because of state governing laws and so forth. I don't know. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, everybody has access to internet these days, and they just Google things and they see a lot of information out there. It would be nice to have, like, this is the initial resources for you to get into it, and more specific to Tennessee. I think that would be a good start.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of what I'm hearing from this online group is the resource Carson has put together, taking an inventory of all the local policies is really helpful. But what would be more helpful too is to understand how these are being implemented and what's been successful in these communities, in addition to knowing what policies exist.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's like it seems like there's two tracks going on here. One is, let's say you're a planning commissioner, elected official, and I'm like, hey, all right, we're interested in looking at tree ordinances. I know we keep talking about it, but it's fine. So what did Mountain Dew going to do? What are we learning? And maybe that's something that we all can be doing, our GNRC, in terms of some gatherings of folks on particular topics. Go, this is the stuff that's actually working well, or you're getting this unintended consequence. So you don't just keep adapting or adopting the same stuff if it's not working in another place. And then from what I really also noticed, and I totally agree with, would love to re-emphasize, is there is a lot of information out there, but sometimes we're not tailoring it well to look. If you're in Murfreesboro, if you're in certain areas, you got very little soils, you got a lot of high phosphate, you know, it's a very different dynamic of planting a tree or managing your farm than if you're in another place, even in these 10 or 12 counties. So trying to make sure some of the information is really relevant, because we have some really unusual and hyper-specific habitat and I don't know what the right word is, but anyway, it's not like you can take the information and say, oh, I'm in growing zone 7. You know, that's kind of not helpful. If you're on, you know, limestone soils and you've got shallow groundwater interactions, you need to know what you're doing. You're just going to plant a tree and it's going to die.
Thank you, Dory. To try to tap a couple of the other people in the chat that I see that we haven't heard from. Emily, I know you joined and are kind of catching up, but if you have any thoughts to share, feel free. I'm also seeing Tara and Casey Lee, and we haven't heard too much from you all, as well as you, Maverick. So if you all have any thoughts you want to share, feel free to unmute and pipe in.
I'll mention really quick. So since we're kind of on this topic of, making the existing programs discoverable to sort of like the general public or, sort of a lay person type of thing. I've heard of a couple of tools that are being developed that have had some success in that arena. One is through Thrive, the Thrive Regional Partnership. They're doing a landowner assistance type of tool where they've sort of compiled all the different type of conservation programs that are available to private landowners kind of by county. And so, they can see if they're eligible for different things, based on the county that they live in. It's still up to the lay person or the public person to still sort of reach out to those individual, to those program folks, which can be a barrier, in a time constraint. And then there's just, the acronym soup that comes with federal agencies and all of that kind of stuff. And so, user support type of positions, maybe an option for, getting information into the people's hands who need it the most. So that's one tool. Another that I've heard about is through kind of a private company that's developed something for family farms. And I think like the American Forest Foundation helped fund it. And it's called woodscamp.org or something like that. But it will kind of generate a report for individual landowners, also forestry landowners, to find out like what types of programs they may be eligible for. And they do a lot of social media, geofencing type of things to sort of get the word out about that resource. And the nice thing about that is that it captures the landowner's information and their interests. And so then it asks them, do they want a visit from somebody who provides technical assistance? And so then, they can have a forestry professional come to their farm and talk with them about all the different programs that are available. So, I think there's some, use of, if we're talking about, trying to capture, trying to get information in the hands of folks who need it, that may be some ways to get that information out.
Great.
Hello.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm being passed back to the room. We're going back to the large group discussion. So thank you all for your patience and participating in that small group. Carson's going to take back over the front of the room now. So I'm going to go back on mute for us.
Yes, thank you, hybrid group. I got to sit in with this group over here, so I'm just going to do our little report out of some of the things we talked about. We kind of talked about issues as well as kind of policy ideas, but we did bring up how we should really feature some of this research into more of a visualized impact, so that it has more impact at the engagement leadership level when we get to that point, as well as kind of featuring best practices and having like a case study of how not only their ordinances, but how they got the political buy-in and the votes and success to pass it through. Phil brought up an incentive that he had heard of called the Young and the Landless program, where it was matching young farmers to land to be farmed, where they maybe didn't have the capital or resources to find that, and that someone wanted to sell off their farm, but maybe not to a developer, and they wanted to sell it to an actual farmer. So that was a really interesting matching program. We also talked about some barriers, especially at the state level, is like how to manage conserved lands post-acquisition, and the accessibility of those lands and how those tie into liabilities. So now you've conserved this land, but how well do you manage it in order to maintain it in a good state? And then we also just talked about general workforce development and training that you can do in different ways to help this effort. So Heidi brought up this program UT is doing on contractor training on best practices. And so even if you couldn't convince the developer, if you could convince the contractor to do something different, then maybe that's a benefit. So those were some of the things we talked about, in addition to some just kind of reactions to issues that are probably happening. I'm going to turn it to Mary to talk about what the online group discussed.
Okay, I'm going to unmute on my laptop. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, on the online group, we talked a lot about how the inventory of all the resources that Carson's created is really helpful, and something that seems to be a solution to a lot of people is to understand what resources exist in the region, but then also what is working in other places and what is being achieved, so that we're not, replicating something that might not work quite right, to help understand that. A lot of what we talked about too in our group was bridging the gap between zoning and policy and the homeowners that it affects, and how that planting, we dove a lot into tree ordinances and how replanting trees is available for homeowners, and what programs homeowners can use to replace trees after a storm or to put trees in at their property, and then also what educational activities there are that help them understand not just what programs there are, but what kind of trees they need to be putting back in, what care needs to be done for those trees. I think a few people talked about some festivals they've been to that are really successful in public outreach, as well as some other programs. Emily mentioned a Thrive landowner assistance tool that has a listing of all conservation tools that are out there available to homeowners, that she thinks is really helpful. Great. Yes. Thank you.
For you.
I feel like we just complained, but, it's okay. Let's tell you what's related. No, I guess from my perspective, coming from land conservation, I was talking about, we're just way behind, in planning for conservation when, there's so much land being developed. We also talked about how if you're talking about the average private landowner, incentivizing them in some way financially. Right now, we mostly just depend on donated conservation easements and people who might want to take a tax benefit for that. I was telling them, we work with tons of people who just love their land, and they don't, they're not rich, they're not in it for the tax deduction, but, they sometimes can't even afford the cost of doing easements. So incentivizing in some way, paying people to protect their land, paying for those development rights is really the only way we're ever going to be able to compete with the pace of development right now. And there's some good models out there that other states have done, but right now we've been taught, I think I've been saying this for 15 years, we need to do more outside of just the federal programs that are challenging to use to incentivize private landowners. What else did we talk about? Yeah, we talked about the open space definition under the Greenbelt law, and if there was, I don't know how often that is even used. I think most people qualify for ag and forestry.
Some of the programs that might be available, I guess historically there are funds or the wetlands fund that is available to help people actually conserve their land if they're needed. Maybe need to be more publicized. And I think one of the unique ones was what Brookie was saying about potentially getting some of the big corporations that are moving to build some cities to participate in conservation, kind of offset whatever development they're doing.
That's great. All right. That's kind of a lot to summarize, so I'm just going to kind of pivot to the next group. I don't really need to repeat all that. Sorry for the online group. This group, who wants to talk?
I'm in the middle of it. Well, from like an incentivize or encourage, having a health focus, access to recreational activities, open space has health benefits, and there are some studies that show $1 spent on public land or recreational land equates to dollars not spent on healthcare costs. So putting that in there, I think, could be beneficial. Value capture options on open space and public parks. We talked about, the city of Tullahoma made a communal goal of having every resident within 1 mile of a park, and they're working really well to reach that goal. So that's not really requiring park development, but with that overall goal, people kind of are more likely to want to push towards that. So things like that, creating a common goal that helps people push towards it.
Putting more teeth to tree ordinances.
Yeah.
A lot of them have been around for a while, so there's a real big push now to update and revise them, more the living document, should be, update those, so see what we update the ones that don't have a lot of teeth or, and look at someone doing good things, just kind of help, spread that more across.
And then figuring out who our audience is when we are talking about this, because it's going to vary between the individual person, planning commissions, elected officials, and how do we have a targeted messaging strategy that can get to that core person when we're discussing it.
Great. All right, well, it's 1:05, so I don't want to take you too long. Just heads up, our next meeting, because we are quarterly, will be Wednesday, May 11th, so won't see you for a bit. I hope to summarize kind of what we talked about today, maybe do additional research, see how that goes. If we feel like we've talked this to death, or if we really want to spend another meeting on it, we can. So if we don't need to spend another meeting on it, we might move on to the next topic. And so I'm going to send you all a survey of how did you like this workshop? How did you like the research? Did you feel it was beneficial, the format, as well as what should our next topic be? I think we're going towards water, but just how general or specific that should be. And also, GNRC is hiring multiple positions. If you want to share this with your network, if you know anybody who needs a job. We have an intern position as well, if you know any students that may need some help. But that's it for me. Thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you to our online folks for dealing with technical issues. And we're good.